I'm Mangino. Welcome to the Mangino Talks podcast. We talk about everything that matters to Pittsburgh, from current events to Pittsburgh history, social issues to sports, politics to practical day-to-day life. And today we are talking local politics, the Allegheny County executive race. Now that we have our candidates from the primary, Sara Innamorato for the Democrats and Joe Rockey for the Republicans, we're talking about endorsements that have recently come out. There have been a couple of them that have been worthy of the news. Joe Rockey gets an endorsement from Leuna. It's a labor organization. And Sara Innamorato gets an endorsement from Allegheny County Executive Rich Fitzgerald. What's interesting about that endorsement is that he endorsed Michael Lamb in the primary. I'm sure you all remember that. And he also said some pretty strong things against Democratic Socialists and this mindset that many of them have to where they're capable of winning elections. They can energize a base, but he has great concerns, or at least he had great concerns, that they're capable of winning. They're just not capable of governing. And he pointed out their leader in Bernie Sanders, the standard bearer for the Democratic Socialists, as a great example of someone who is able to win re-election. He's able to get a lot of energy around him in his campaigns for the presidency. But as a U.S. Senator, he's accomplished little to nothing legislatively. The concern is, well, what happens if you get somebody like that into the county executive race, right? And we're going to get into that quite a bit. On the Joe Rockey side, a labor union that would endorse a Republican. And there are some labor unions that do endorse Republicans. Law enforcement, police unions oftentimes do that. First responders unions oftentimes will endorse Republicans because the way the Democrats have decided to go after votes nowadays, they are not necessarily pro-police. Now, what's interesting about this is that the one question that was brought up regarding the endorsement of this labor union was the idea of how important is it? The headline in the Trib says Republican Joe Rockey picks up key labor endorsement in Allegheny County executive race. And I have to say, I don't see how key it ultimately is. And the reason being is that they typically don't back winners. They've been backing losers on a statewide level for some time now. So it isn't as though they are truly representative of where labor is going. There are other labor organizations that are a whole lot more important. But Philip Amaris, he is the business manager for the Western Pennsylvania Laborers District Council, Leuna, and he says that Rockey is a centrist who supports using local laborers. And I would agree with that. That when you look at Joe Rockey as a Republican, he is a moderately minded Republican. Well, one person said he kind of reminds him of a John Hines, that kind of distinguished politician, one that has some real blue-collar roots, unlike Hines, but is one that is not an extreme right candidate. Does not come off as a pro-Trump Republican, not a MAGA guy, which will make things difficult for him coming up in the general election because I'm not sure he's going to be able to, of himself, energize a base. What he's going to need is that base to be energized against Sara Innamorato more so than being energized for himself. But a centrist he clearly is. And this Philip Amaris, once again the business manager of the Western Pennsylvania Laborers District Council, says that ultimately that in this crucial election, we must elect a candidate who is qualified, who has the knowledge on how to move Allegheny County forward, and who understands the extreme political views will only cause division and stifle development and progress. And the extreme views that he's most concerned about are the extreme views of the left and this idea of being opposed to industry and the great jobs that come from industry. Clearly, you have to do what you can to rein industry in the sense of holding them accountable to the regulations that are local and statewide and on a federal basis. But they are the ones that ultimately provide the great jobs that this union is interested in protecting and advancing. He goes on to say that as a result of endorsing him, it's not a Democrat or a Republican issue, it's a union issue. What's interesting, too, is in the endorsement in the primary, they endorsed John Weinstein. Now, what's interesting about that is that Weinstein is opposed to fracking. He supported a fracking ban. Well, Sara Innamorato supports a fracking ban. Amara said that Innamorato's support of a fracking ban in Allegheny County was a factor in LeLuna choosing to back Rockey. But it's interesting. It's obviously not a major one because they decided to go ahead and back Weinstein, who was also opposed to fracking. One of the issues that Rockey is going to have to be dealing with coming up is his position on the minimum wage that was passed by county council to go to $18 an hour for a starting wage initially, up to $20 an hour come 26. And at this point, the Trib says that he's been dodging questions about whether he supports the $20 minimum wage bill, which is interesting because he's also in favor of enforcing prevailing wage laws in Allegheny County. Well, why would you be in favor of supporting prevailing wage laws that, from a taxpayer perspective, cause taxpayers to pay more for services than they otherwise would need to because of that prevailing wage? They can't go and get a better price from somebody who is willing to offer them labor at a discounted price. The county forces itself through prevailing wage laws, the state does as well, to pay more than they otherwise need to. But then he's opposed to this minimum wage that has been passed by the county council. Why? And he doesn't want to talk about it because, in one hand, he doesn't see this as being a winner to be opposed to it, even though he may very well be. But then he also can't make the logical argument of being opposed to this, but being pro-prevailing wage. It'll be interesting to see how he decides to handle this ultimately moving forward. You know, one of the things that makes Joe Rockey an appealing candidate, along with being a centrist, is his experience at PNC Bank, where he was responsible for a division that had upwards of 6,000 employees in it. He already understands the idea of managing. He gets governance. He gets the idea of, I am the one who has to make decisions here. One of the great problems with these Democratic Socialists that have been campaigning and have been winning is that they don't know that. And I think the brightest example of that would be Mayor Ed Gainey, where as a member of the House, he was able to stay true to his ideology and vote accordingly. And ultimately, it wasn't about making the final decision on things. It wasn't about needing to have this aspect of compromise. As we talked with Allegheny County Executive Rich Fitzgerald back in May in our first podcast about being pragmatic, that you can have liberal ideas. And he was very liberally minded as he served on council. But when he came to the county executive position, he realized that the liberal ideology has to be set aside because you now represent everyone. You are the decision maker. And not only do you determine where the county goes, you determine and play a major role, if not just flat out determine, the direction of the entire region of southwestern Pennsylvania. Speaking of Allegheny County Executive Rich Fitzgerald and having him on my podcast, he made some very interesting comments about why it is he ultimately endorsed Michael Lamb and the concerns that he has over Sara Innamorato, because she was the front runner at the time of my interview. She was the one expected to win and win handily based upon the polling that was out just a few days before the election. And one of the things that he expressed a concern about was that there was all this outside money that is coming in. People who have no connection to Allegheny County at all, except for promoting ideologies. We're throwing a lot of money at the DA's race and the county executive race. Here's Allegheny County Executive Rich Fitzgerald from my podcast on May 15th.
The outside money is concerning because why do they care? What is somebody in Brooklyn from the Socialist Party? Why are they trying to influence what goes on in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County? And we see them doing it in the district attorney's race. We see them doing it in the county executive race. And you have to question, what's their real motivation? It's one thing for a labor union PAC or even a developer PAC or some of the other entities that have an interest in who gets elected, what type of policies. But when it's coming out of Brooklyn with the Workers' Party, the Socialist Party, that gets a little concerned. We should all be concerned about that here in southwestern Pennsylvania.
What's interesting about it is that all of a sudden he doesn't have that concern any longer because he just recently decided to endorse Sara Innamorato and spoke glowingly of her and her abilities to be able to run the county. And says that he's willing to help her every way that he can. And I don't think that she's going to need him to win the election, but she definitely needs his advice and counsel when it comes to ultimately governing this region, because she doesn't have one example across the country of somebody of her mindset successfully running anything from an executive position. Nothing. I'm not even sure she has examples of people who were like-minded to her being able to effectively bring about legislation on a regional, state, and federal level. Here's more from Allegheny County Executive Rich Fitzgerald about the concerns of winning elections, but can they govern?
One thing that's happened in my party, the Democratic Party, is we've got a group of people who, from the far left, the socialists, the DSA, the Democratic Socialists, who have been very good at winning elections. They know how to win elections, but they don't know how to govern. They haven't proved that they could get things done for the betterment of the folks here in southwestern Pennsylvania. And that's really concerning. And I do hear that all the time from longtime Democrats.
And it should be something that all of us are talking about. When we decide who we're going to vote for coming up in November, do you want somebody that is viewed as an extremist, that self-identifies as an extremist, that is that far left, that doesn't have the ability, historically speaking, from people within this group to actually come to the middle and to properly govern in any way? The leader of this group, Bernie Sanders, and Rich Fitzgerald has some really striking comments regarding Bernie.
Bernie Sanders has been in Congress for years, has never gotten anything done, has never gotten a bill passed, but he makes a lot of noise. And he's very good at grandstanding and telling everybody that they're horrible and corporate America is horrible and all these bad things that happen. Some of what he says is not far off in his statements, but now you've got to sit down with people and get things done. You've got to compromise.
You do have to compromise. You have to be willing to come to the middle. So are we going to vote for someone who's going to have to fake the idea of coming to the middle? Or are we going to vote for someone who's already understanding the great values of middle-class, hard-working southwestern Pennsylvania, as a man who grew up with a father and a grandfather, both in the unions, that also has that education and work experience of a governing sort that can bring it all together? That's the question everybody has to ask themselves. In fact, I asked Rich Fitzgerald how concerned he is about the entire region moving forward if the wrong person were to win in May in the primary for the Democrats. And this is what he had to say.
I don't think people realize that the direction we go, working with the corporate community, working with our friends in Harrisburg, working with the administration in Washington, the voice comes from the county executive. And what is the direction that we're going to move? what are we going to invest in the future? Are we going to talk about energy and sustainability? Are we going to talk about cutting off literally the economic engine that we've had for the last 15 years when it comes to Marcellus Shale? Or are we going to figure out a way to make it work in an environmentally sustainable way?
Well, Sara Innamorato doesn't want to hear about environmentally sustainable way. She's willing to cut off the economic engine. Rich Fitzgerald also saying this about his concerns for the entire region moving forward as well.
Allegheny County, because of the fact that it is a very blue county, you're going to see, and we've seen it at the city council, county council, state rep, Congress, other offices in which they've been very successful in winning the races, but again, not so successful in effectively governing for the improvement of people's lives.
So what are we going to do? And what explains Rich Fitzgerald's decision to endorse somebody that just a few weeks ago he thought would be a grave concern for this region if they were to be nominated? Did he not realize prior to the election who she was and what she had to offer, and now is convinced of something that he wasn't aware of before? Not the case, because he clearly knew who she was. In fact, he says his daughter spoke very highly of her. I'm reading from a story in the Post-Gazette that references a story from WESA. He offered her a job as his administrative assistant, going back to when Austin Davis ran for the state house. Davis held the assistant position, went on to become a lawmaker, now Pennsylvania's lieutenant governor. And he said at a rally over the weekend, there was this young woman from Lawrenceville who my daughter kept telling me about, who was really a dynamic person, a woman by the name of Sara Innamorato. So he offers her this job to be his administrative assistant. She obviously declined, and he went on to say that she told him that she was going to run for the state house. And here's a quote. And I, like an old wise person, I say, it probably won't work out for you. And when it doesn't, come on back and come and work in my office. She never needed to do that. Fitzgerald now says that she would do a great job. Well, then why didn't he endorse her in the first place? I mean, it's one thing to say, listen, I like what Michael Lamb has to offer better than somebody else, although there really isn't a lot. I can't think of a lot negative to think about or say about any of his challengers. I just think that Michael Lamb is the guy, and here are the reasons why he's the guy. But Rich decided to go negative on Sara Innamorato during the campaign. And now, all of a sudden, whatever his concerns were before, and it sounded as though he was genuine. And I encourage you to go back and listen to the podcast and my interview with him when he expresses all of this. And you, too, will be kind of scratching your heads at why it is he's now endorsing her. What is it? Just a good Democrat? Is that what it is? I mean, it's one thing to just, passively give an endorsement that she really doesn't need anyway. I mean, the Democrats are leading in registered voters by 2-1 in Allegheny County. She doesn't need his endorsement. What she does need from him, though, is advice and counsel on how to run this county. That's what she could use. She could use some advice and counsel on how you have to set aside your liberal ideologies from a lawmaker's perspective and then recognize the great importance of becoming that pragmatic individual when you take on a county executive position. Have you heard anything that would give you the impression that she's ready to make that move, that she has a desire to make the move? Now, granted, we're early on in the campaign, and in a general election, you typically have people who are going to then move a little bit more to the center in order to win a general election race. I don't think that's going to happen. If I had to put money on it at Rivers Casino right now, I would put money on that she's going to stay the course, believe the Democrats are going to unify behind her, take the endorsement of Rich Fitzgerald and Mayor Ed Gainey, and believing that she can then ride that to a victory in November. Will Republicans stay unified and show up to vote in large numbers? Will independents decide to go and vote and say, you know what, I want somebody who is moderately minded, who has experience in running something of this size, at least with the number of employees, grasp the concept of being an executive, and will moderate Democrats who just see what's happening with Ed Gainey and the way that he's running the city. I mean, do you think Ed Gainey is demonstrating as mayor of Pittsburgh of his ideology and his mindset? Are you ready to see that be expanded to the entire county and then have the entire region of southwestern Pennsylvania be hinging on that? Then why would you move forward with anybody that he would endorse? And I'm hoping to have Rich Fitzgerald back on the program again to ask him how it is that he went from having great concerns about Democratic Socialists and what their agenda is and their inability to govern, how he went from that to a full endorsement and says that she'll do a great job and he's ready to help her every way he can. He's a man that's always willing to step up. I have no doubts that he ultimately will, and I'm looking forward to having him on. You've been listening to the Mangino Talks podcast. New episodes drop Monday through Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern, wherever you get your podcast. Doesn't make a difference. Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon Music, iHeart, Odyssey, and more. For more on me and the show, be sure to visit ManginoTalks.com. While you're there, make sure you email me with any thoughts you have, ideas you have for the show. Would appreciate that. Follow me on your favorite social media platform by using @Mangino Talks, or you can just Google Mangino Talks. And once you find me, please like, follow, subscribe, and share the pages with your friends and family. And thanks again for listening to the Mangino Talks podcast.